Hi.
Welcome to Women That Shred. I'm
Thank you
here
for having me.
with Lorraine Connell, and I'm actually really like super duper excited for this one because I've been really thinking about it. Usually, like before a show, I kind of, I'm just like, oh, you know what? Come Wednesday, I'll figure out what I'm going to say. But today, I was actually like, I got to think about our topic. And speaking of which, Christina just hop on. She just hopped in. Sorry, I can't speak. What is going on? Hello, Christina. And yeah, so we're talking about biases, but I do want to kind of address like how you even ended up at this point
Yeah.
and why you even address it.
Do you want me to
Welcome.
just go? Okay, so
We just like literally dive in because it's only 30
okay.
minutes, and I know
Okay.
that like we will have so much to talk about. So yeah, I want to just like go
All
for
right,
it.
here we go. So I was a teacher for 20 years. I taught chemistry, and through that journey, at the end, I started to realize that in order to manage my classroom, everybody talks about classroom management. In order to manage my classroom really effectively, I had to put kids in boxes. And what started to come up for me was that in order to box them up, I was making real quick judgments about these students and like sorting them based on nothing other than the way they looked, the way they walked into the classroom, the way they spoke to me in that moment. And and the more I thought about how I was using my own biases to really sort my kids, it started to make me reflect on where else my biases were coming up. And so I created some professional development for teachers. And then I started to think about, wow, like in the realty world, the mortgage world, the appraisal world, biases are
Mhm.
really, really present. And in fact, I was just at a presentation of one of my classes, and somebody said to me that they really have to trust their instincts. And it made me wonder, what are our gut instincts? What are our instincts? What are they based on? Are they based on biases? And what how does that play out if they are?
Yeah, no, I think it's definitely such an interesting topic. And really quickly, too, Christina was a teacher. She was a preschool teacher. So I know that she
Oh,
can appreciate that you were a teacher as well.
yeah.
But yeah, oddly enough, I'm reading a book called The Self Delusion. And it's talking about how we perceive things, and a lot has to do with our experiences, right? Like how can we know something's bad or good unless our experience was good or bad, right? So even with biases, a lot I was realizing a lot has to do with our experience, right? Like, and so that's kind of like I think a lot of people forget that like it's embedded, from our
Yeah.
childhood. Like even myself, I was thinking about it, and a lot has to do with me as a kid and what I experienced as a kid, and then to kind of get out of that bias. Like, how do you even kind of configure your brain to not have that bias anymore?
Well, and I mean, I think that's the biggest misconception is that biases are bad, and they aren't great, but they do sort of help us navigate our lives. And it's when we recognize that we have biases that we can start to sort of dismantle when they are not good and they are good. And so it's all about really just making yourself aware that you have those biases. And I love there's and I want for your listeners to know that there is a great quiz that Harvard has put out. It's called Implicit Bias Survey. And you can go through and see if you actually have a bias. And if you find yourself like doing the activity and you're like, this is rigged, it's probably because you have an implicit bias that you don't know about.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, no, maybe we'll have to find the link, and then maybe Dal can pop it up.
Yeah.
Because we do love some good quizzes and exercises on this show.
It really is amazing. Like you would say, so I did the bias or the test on ability, right? So do I have a bias towards people who are disabled or people who are disabled. And
Yeah.
I personally have a little bit of a disability. So I was like, I'm sure I don't, but I literally prefer able-bodied people. And so, like I said just a minute ago, like, it's not that that's a bad thing, but I need to know that I have it so that as I interact with people in this world, I can check myself and not just go forward and do whatever feels natural to me, whatever behavior I have, because if my implicit bias is preventing me from really like engaging well, then it is not the best thing.
Right. So right now you're doing this for real estate agents, right? Like this is part of your the
Yes.
CEE requirements. So what are you finding? Like, I mean, because I'm assuming that a lot of these agents, kind of speak up and interact with what you have to say. So like, is there kind of an underlining theme that you see maybe in the industry at all?
Well, I mean, if you take the industry as a whole, it is predominantly a more feminine, more female-based, um, employment option, right? And not that that's, like, across the board, but the people who show up to my classes, it's heavily female and less male, and so we talk a lot about that, like, safety factor, right? And,
Ooh,
like,
yeah.
thinking about how do I proceed forward in checking my safety, but also being aware of my biases and not letting my bias prevent me from interacting with a customer, interacting with my peers, or interacting with superiors.
Yeah, because I mean, I was talking about this the other day. I was at a real estate agency. Like it was, they were talking about safety essentially, but it was a lot had to do with the biases, right? Like when someone
Mhm.
walks in, you automatically are kind of like, oh, you start coming up with a whole narrative in your head,
Oh.
right? But a lot too, like you said in the beginning, was your gut, right? It's also being able to follow your gut. And I think that's where a lot of us tend to struggle. I know that I have struggled with that all my life, that listening to my inner voice, my gut, but then also having the outside world and outside chatter telling me otherwise. So that I find like, how do you deal with that?
Well, and it kinda goes into the idea of stereotypes, right? So, like, stereotypes exist because there are, like, instances that support those stereotypes. But if we just generalize, then we're never gonna get to why that stereotype doesn't always come
Mhm.
through. And I think, going back to that comment that you made about your experiences, a negative experience is going to color your gut
Mm.
way more than a positive experience or multiple positive experience. And I can tell you, like, I get, like, all tense whenever I'm, like, getting ready to sit in a parent-teacher conference because I had several 1 or 2 bad experiences where a parent, like, confronted me and I wasn't, like, prepared, and so we get these we get these inner voices and these gut reactions based on a stereotype that is then confirmed by one experience, especially if it's a bad experience. And then we have to work really hard to like detract ourselves from that belief that we hold.
Yeah, that's a tough one because like you mentioned, where it's not just real estate, it's appraisals, right? So I know recently there was a huge story, that was all over social media about how an appraisal was very low because of the person's home. And then when they switched it out to a different person, how it totally changed the appraisal. And, I had actually done a post or like around summer. I was getting ready to sell my house or my condo, and I made a post about how my agent called me and said, "Hey, the appraiser's coming tomorrow, like, be ready." I'm like, "Oh my gosh, I'm in or I'm out of town, like I'm not there. And I remembered I didn't make my bed. So, like, as a joke, I was like, oh my gosh, is it going to affect my appraisal because I didn't make my bed? And I had clothes in the corner, like on the floor. I had an early flight, and it really actually stressed me out. Well, it was amazing how many people started commenting on the post about, oh, it depends on the clothing, if it's designer clothing,
Ooh.
or like, so the fact that people were making fun of the fact that, like, I might actually like have it appraised differently, which we all know that wasn't going to be the case. But the fact that that was like a conversation means that those biases and those stereotypes are like legit and real, and like prevalent still, that people were commenting that way. And I was like, geez, like, oh my gosh, are we still like in that world where, depending on where the clothes are from, we're going to just assume that that means that someone has a lot of money?
Well, and I think of, like, the intent behind the Fair Housing Act and the different groups that we tend to discriminate against, and just sort of walking some of that stuff back to where it might be coming from for people really brings up a lot of animosity. And like, I, as not a realtor, not in the real estate industry really at all, I'm coming at it from like, but my realtor's like my connection to the property. Like, they're my trusted resource. And shouldn't I be able to like depend on them to give me the lowdown, give me the information? And it's really interesting for me to put that forward and see the differences in the room. And people are like, "Oh, no, 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 you can't do that." And you can't. But like, having some of the other people in the room going like, "Oh, yeah. How do I navigate that?" And
Yeah.
my favorite part of these classes is the collaboration and the idea sharing that these realtors get to share with each other, because our biases are part of our everyday activities. Everything we do is colored by some sort of bias, implicit or explicit.
Yeah. And I mean, and it's such a tough one, because even the conversation that we're having right now, for some people might be uncomfortable. Just,
Yeah.
the fact that we're even talking about this. And I think that's the thing, is just having those conversations. And like you said, in a classroom, having people collaborate and talk and maybe give each other advice, and maybe say, hey, you know what? I didn't realize that. Wow, maybe I should look into that a little bit further as to why I act that way, or why those biases come up. And I think it, at the end of the day, is just, it's that sense of self-awareness, that at least you know that you're doing it. So, okay, now that I know, like Oprah says, once you know better, you do better. So I think that's what essentially it is like, we need to know better so that we can do better. But it's having those conversations in the first place can be really, really difficult, because I mean, in the mortgage industry, I mean, we still see it all the time, all the time. And we keep saying like, oh no, we're doing better, we're doing better. And I agree, we're doing better, but I think a lot of people don't know better. That's why they're not doing better.
Well,
So how
and
do we,
there's such a gap, from being better and where we start where we
yeah,
started.
yeah. And so that's kind of like, I love that you are even able to give those classes, because when you think of CE credits, require, you think of something that's a little bit more, I guess, well, I don't know what's the word, but like I don't, like schoolish, or whatever you want to talk about. Like, I feel like biases is more of a, it's a very abstract
Yes. It's
topic.
not cut and dry. It's not
Yeah,
black and
yeah,
white. And
that's
and
right.
honestly, so much of this particular work, and I like to say that I'm a diversity, equity, and inclusion awareness builder, because all
Mhm.
I wanna do, what my real objective is for most of these classes, is for people to come in one place and leave asking more questions. And if they're asking more questions, then they are being more aware. And if they're more aware, then they are going to at least see opportunities for doing better. And I want to highlight the reason why a lot of times it makes people uncomfortable is because I'm afraid that you're going to judge me for being a bad person. I'm afraid I don't know, And that maybe makes me look like I'm stupid or ignorant. And so, in order to avoid those two really powerful, uncomfortable feelings, we just avoid them. So I challenge your listeners to think of a time where maybe you did something where, maybe your bias prevented you from doing the right thing, and think of how you felt and what you did after you experienced that. I know when I sort of came to the realization of what I was doing with students, like I was embarrassed. I was really horrified and I just wanted to like pretend I didn't do it, right? So that's like my gut instinct is to pretend I didn't do wrong. And when we do that, we are just perpetuating this problem. And so if you can come to my class and you can have this conversation with somebody else and you can say, "Oh, it's all hypothetical right now, but when it happens in real life, maybe now you have somebody that you can like reach out to who is you can say, "Remember when we were in that class? Like something happened and can I just talk to you about it?" Because we're all coming at it from a place where we want to be better.
Yeah. No, I agree. I feel like we do want to be better, but it's also kind of that self-realization of, oh gosh, maybe I'm not as nice or as wonderful as I thought I was because I'm having these thoughts right now. And I've had that before, where I've been in a situation where I'm like, Raquel, like, why are you thinking this way? And then I also have to give myself grace of like, okay, once again, my experiences, my just the way I'm perceiving it, maybe I should be looking at it in a different lens. But if you can at least question yourself and you can at least sit there and kind of have that conversation and then kind of figure out, okay, maybe this is why this is happening, okay, how can I change it and how can I do better? But I think unfortunately a lot of people don't even get to that place where they have that conversation with themselves. They just kind of move on, and I think that's where it's really important. We need to stop and acknowledge like what is happening in that moment. And hi, Calvin. Sorry, I just wanted to welcome Calvin.
Bye.
Yeah, so I think that's really important too. Is just questioning ourselves. Yeah,
Yeah, and that I mean, that is hard, I
it is
don't
really
wanna discount that requires vulnerability, and we do so much, Brené Brown will tell you, we do so much putting up that armor to prevent vulnerability, and when we put that armor up, then we prevent the ability to really connect with somebody else, and I don't know if anybody has seen the SNL clip about the 5-hour empathy drink, and it is so powerful to me. I know it's meant to be in jest, but, like, to empathize with somebody else, you have to, like, accept their reality and maybe even accept that their scenario was pretty shitty. Oh,
oh no, I've said that word before plenty of times. Don't worry.
pretty crappy, and so I don't wanna have to feel that, and so I am just gonna avoid it. Again, it's that avoidance, that fear, that judgment that we're all worried about, that we're just gonna pretend nothing is wrong.
Yeah, and you just said something really powerful that actually just had like kind of a light bulb moment for myself where it's because of the empathy, you're feeling it too. And that's what happens to me. I'm like, I don't want to feel it. Like, for people, and this is something that I struggle with, is, I was clinically depressed when I was in high school and college, and I attempted suicide. And so I've been
Mm.
in a really dark, bad place where I was not okay. And when there are others that are experiencing that, because it's like a trigger for me and I don't want to have to go back, it's hard because I almost have this like rejection of like, no, 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 like I can't feel what you're feeling right now because then I have to feel it and I'm not ready to do that again. And so I've come to realize that that's a lot what's happening with me. It's not so much of like, oh, I'm happy and you're not and I got to be in my happy place. It's like, oh gosh, like I'm going to start having those feelings and I don't know how to manage those feelings right now. And so it's like it gets really intense and it gets really deep. And but once again, in order to have true empathy, you have to acknowledge that and as well. I mean, I know, and for a lot of people, it's a lot of work. And a lot of people rather just not even deal with it. But if we're gonna change the world and if we're gonna be better, we have to do the work.
Well, and I think that, I said earlier that it's not bad to have a bias. It's
Right.
bad to pretend it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And what having a bias that you don't aren't ready to acknowledge you have, it puts up barriers, and the barriers prevent you connecting with other people because of your inability to be self-aware, to accept certain things. And for me as a teacher, I saw that barrier a lot with students that I couldn't connect to, and it took me to go backwards, like, why am I not connecting with those kinds of kids or that, like, stereotype group? And it was because of my bias and my lack of willingness to accept that I had that bias.
Yeah. I think now I sometimes tend to do the opposite. It's those kids that I had a bias towards when I was younger, right? Because I was like such a goody goody and I was just like this perfectionist and everything was just like, I like was such a priss. So it was the students that were seen as kind of the outsiders and the rebels and all of that. And kind of, I kind of would steer away because of that bias of like, oh, they're bad. No, it's just
Mm,
now I realize that a lot of them had situations where that was their way of kind of expressing themselves because there was a lack of maybe something at home or they weren't getting the attention and that was how they got attention. So kind of now understanding that as an adult, now when I interact with kids, I tend to gravitate towards those kids because
mm,
I want them to understand like, hey, you know what? I had a bias towards you. I don't have that anymore. Like I'm learning to understand that like it's coming from a different place. And so it's even at age 47 you can still learn and you can still change and you can still evolve, and I think that's really important too because I think a lot of us tend to think, well, I'm an adult now, there's no changing me at this point, right? And like that's another bias. you know?
yeah. Right, it's that, and now we go into that growth mindset, like, or fixed mindset. I'm not good at this, so I'm just not going to try,
Yeah.
or I don't wanna feel that discomfort. Man, it is hard to accept that growth. It really can be so, uncomfortable in the beginning. I'll say though, when you get through that discomfort and you're outside, like, growing, it's so empowering, but,
It
like,
is good.
it's like going up a hill to get to the other side. You don't really wanna go up that hill because it requires a lot of energy and and attempts at making mistakes.
Yeah, and I think I mean it's like that everywhere. I mean even right now where, just Josh Pitts who does Shred Media, he does a lot of marketing, branding and social media and talks about how putting out yourself out there, and that's the same thing too, right? Like so many people are so scared because they know that there's so many biases out there on the other side of the phone or the computer, and so then we get so scared about that judgment,
Mm.
and so that's like a whole nother layer too. But the thing is like what do you have like any steps that you could kind of maybe share for any of us that we know it's going to be so uncomfortable, we know it's going to be painful, we know it's going to suck, but we know we have to do it. It's like sometimes you just go, well, where do I even start, and so that's why I'm curious, like if you have at least like steps.
I my One of my favorite things to do is kind of, go through some scenarios, like
Mm.
scenarios that, biases might be present or not present. Like, think of a scenario. I think I describe, one where you've got, a man and a woman. Um, they're not married, but you don't know that. But it's just like you put all of these parameters in. The man asks about these different questions, like the Jewish synagogue in the area, the genetic hormones, LGBTQ in the school. And like all of those things are not like you can't have those conversations, but your clients are going to ask you certain questions. And so what biases might come up for you, and what do you do when they come up, and how do you navigate, so that if you're working through a scenario before something like that happens, you already start to put tools in place and recognizing that your bias is a tool. And so you can use that tool in a lot of different ways. Some are good and some are not so good. And so I think it's really important for us to run through scenarios before you're faced with that situation, because and even like if you're working in a small group or a large group, like have a couple days where you have a lunch meeting where somebody brings a scenario. Maybe
Mhm.
they submit it to the I'm trying to think of the person in charge of like all the realtors. What are they called?
The broker.
The broker, right? So we all submit some scenarios to the broker, and the broker just reads one out. So it's not tied to me. I don't feel judged, but I can listen and hear what other people would have done, and I can learn from that. And I think, I keep coming back to that fear, that judgment, that like prevention of learning. So if we bring scenarios and they become not specific to any one person, then we can all learn so much.
Yeah, I think that would be key on the mortgage side too, because, once again, unfortunately, you do have a lot of loan officers that tend to stay away or stay clear from certain, community demographic, if you will, because of their biases and stereotypes. And we're just doing a disservice by not being able to serve everybody. So I think that would be key to have groups come in and, like you said, just have a scenario that's just kind of random. It doesn't mean that like you submitted it, and then just start talking about it. Because yeah, I think in a way, and I don't want to say sensitize, that's not the word, but the more that you kind of go through the scenarios when it does happen, I would think that it's like at that point you're like, oh, I've already kind of experienced this, so it's going to be different for me. And I feel like our bodies tend to, and our minds, yeah, like if we go over and over it again beforehand, then that like anxiousness, I feel like, would go away once that scenario happens in real life. You're like, oh, I've already done this before. I know what to do. um yeah, because I feel like that's what happens, right? Our brains kind of come accustomed. That's why it is hard when our kids play video games so much, because it can desensitize us to what they're doing in that video game. So
Yeah.
then it's like out in the real world. So there is something to be said about that, even though I wouldn't urge, the word
Well, and
desensitize.
I also think I would encourage people to be aware of a negative experience and remember that that is one individual experience, and not try and tie it to everything that comes after that. It's super hard and it requires us to work on that. But maybe even if a really uncomfortable situation happened and then you maybe find that that bias is coming up later, do a journal to yourself about like
Mhm.
what role you played, what role the situation happened, what were you pulling in from your background, what weren't you pulling in from background, what weren't you seeing in the situation, and just sort of like push yourself to think about like what biases were coming up, what bias wasn't coming up, how did your bias come up, and just like it doesn't have to be public, but the more you make yourself aware, the better you'll make and do good things out there. And I think, if you go through the Harvard bias checklist and you like say to yourself, do I have a bias or not? Any that come up as a no, I don't have a bias, I encourage you to do the implicit bias test to see, because you may have a slight bias and that just means it comes up occasionally. But, I think we don't realize, and so when somebody confronts us on that bias, it sends us into our defensive mode.
Yeah, my daughter tends to call me out a lot because we'll be out in public and I'll say something. And she goes, Mom, you like to say that you are just so accepting of everyone, this and that. She goes, but did you just hear what you just said about that person? And it's hard because I'm like, no, what are you talking about? Well, I'm so nice. And she's like, no, Mom, like just listen to yourself. And so sometimes when she calls me out, it's awful. Like it's a horrible, horrible feeling, because I'm like, oh my gosh, she's right. But also have to kind of be like, all right, she's right. So let me once again, like, kind of take have that self-awareness and then try to do better next time. So then when I am out and about, I do have my daughter's voice in my head a lot of times. And I mean, it's awful, but at the same time, like it needs to happen. We need to be able to call each other out sometimes too, and that's like a whole nother thing, right? Is
Right.
calling each other out, because a lot of us are scared to do that because of how we're going to be judged. Same thing. So it's a vicious little cycle there, but it needs to happen. And here we go. 30 minutes are up. That's why I wanted to get like right into it. But I think hopefully when people listen to this, they're going to really like take a moment when they're interacting with people, and try to see like, hey, what's happening right here? Like, what am I thinking? Am I stereotyping? Am I, is there a bias? And I think just that in itself is going to be really helpful. Like, so
I hope
I love that we had this conversation and you brought this up, because I really do hope it at least like ignites a little bit of a spark in people.
Yeah, if it just changes one person, we've made things better.
Yes, I agree. Like one person at a time. But thank you. And you know what? Like I like to have repeat guests on here,
Ooh,
so I can always have you back on, because yeah, this is something that we could talk all day long about.
at length,
And I
for
love
sure.
everything about the brain and how we work and function. I'm
Mhm.
very like that, so so I'm all for it.
I love
Um,
that.
yeah, but thank you for those that hopped in. Ashley, Christina, Calvin. I know a lot of people do the replay, so that'll be awesome. But yeah, like thanks again. Like now I'm gonna have like all this thinking for the rest of the
Well, you've
day.
already been thinking about it, which makes it even better. That's really great.
Yes, yes. And I have a conversation with a kid later for my rock the boat. So I'm gonna even see what kind of bias I come at that.
Interesting.
But thank you, Lorraine. And
Thank
thank
you.
you, everyone. And we'll see you all next Wednesday on Women That Trend.